Greetings, everyone. TES Reading Club welcomes you all to another reading episode. Today, we are all here to read out short story excerpts. Short stories are fun to read and they have become really important from the point of view of many exams. So, stay tuned to listen to some wonderful short story excerpts today. And if you wish to read along with us, do join TES Reading Club on Telegram. Without any further delay, let's begin.
Edgar Allan Poe. He was born in 19 January 1809 and he died in 7th October 1849. He was an American writer, poet, editor, and literary critic, and he is best known for his poetry and short stories. He was also a central figure in Romanticism in United States. The Black Cat is a short story which was written by him and published. It was published in 1843. It is a story of an unnamed narrator who has a strong affection for pets until he perversely turned to abusing them. His favorite, a pet black cat, and once the cat scratches him one night, and the narrator punished it by cutting its eye out and then hanging it from a tree. For the most wild yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be expect it. In a case where my very sense reject their own evidence, yet mad am I not? And very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world plainly, succinctly, uh, succinctly and without comment, a series of most mere household events. In consequence, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet I'll not attempt to expound them. To me, they have presented little but horror. To many, they will seem less terrible than borrows. Hereafter, perhaps some intellect may be found which will reduce my pantheism to commonplace, some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive in the circumstances. I dealt with awe. I detailed with awe nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. From my infancy, I was noted for docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make my jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spent most of my time and never was so happy as feeding and cursing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood, I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who have cherished an affection for a faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly to be at trouble of explaining the nature of my intensity of gratification thus derivable. There is something in and the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of brute which goes directly to the heart of him who has had frequent occasion to test the partly friendship and mere fidelity of mere man. I married early and was happy to find in my wife a disposition of an uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. The latter was remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black and sagacious to an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not little tinkered with superstitions, made frequent allusion the ancient popular notion which regard all black cats uh, as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point. I mention the matter at all for no better reason that than that it happens just now to be remembered. Pluto, This was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in the manner for several years, during which my journal temperament and character through instrumentality of refined intemperance, had I blushed to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew day by day more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language of my to my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made feel change in my disposition. I not only neglect but ill use them. For Pluto, however, I still retain sufficient regard to restrain me for maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog. By accident or through affection they came in my way, but my disease grew upon me. For what disease is like alcohol, at a length even Pluto, who was now becoming old and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home much intoxicated from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him when, in his fright at my violence, he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I know myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take its fright from my body, and a more than find this malevolence nature thrill every fiber of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a pen knife, opened it, grasped it, poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eye from the socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder while I pan the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of night debauch, I experienced a sentiment half of horror, half of remorse, and half for the crime of which I have been guilty. But it was at best a feeble and equivocal feelings, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess and soon drowned in wine all memory of deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The shock of the loss I presented in it is true, a fright appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about house as usual, but as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of a creature which had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave a place of irritation, and then came as to my final and irrevocable overthrow. The spirit of perverseness of this spirit philosophy take no account. Yet I am not sure that my soul lives. Then I am at perverseness in one of the primitive impulse of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties, or sometime which gave direction to to the character of man, who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or stupid action for no other reason, just because he know he should not. Have we not a perpetual inclination in the teeth of our best judgment to violate that which is law, merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, come to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning, in cold blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limbs of tree, hung it with the tears streaming from my eyes, and it with the bitterness remorse at my heart, hung it because I knew it. it had loved me, because I felt it had given me no reason of offense, hung it because I knew that in doing so I was committing a sin, a deadly sin that would no jeopardize my immortal soul, as so as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. One night, on the night of the day on which this most cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flames. The whole house was blazing. It was great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself made to escape from the conflagration. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforward to despair. I am above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and the atrocity, but I am detailing a chain of fact and wish not to leave even a possible link imperfect. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, which one exception had fallen in. The exception was found in the compartment wall, not very thick, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering had there, in great measure, resisted the action of the fire, a fact which I attribute to its having been recently spread. About this wall, a dense crowd were collected, and my many persons seemed to be examining a particular portion of it with a minute and eager attention. The word strange, singular, and the other similar expression excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, as if graven a bas relief upon the white surface, a figure of the gigantic the cat. The impression was given with an accuracy truly marvelous. There was a rope about animal's neck. When I first beheld this appreciation, for I could scarcely regard it at less, my wonder and my terror was extreme. But at length, reflection came to my aid. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in the garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden has been immediately filled with crowd by someone whom the animal must have been cut from the tree and thrown through an open window into my chamber. This had probably been This has probably been done with the view of arousing me from sleep. The falling of other walls has compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of freshly spread plaster. The lime of which, with the flames and the ammonia from the carcass, had then accomplished the portrait as I saw it.
Although I thus readily accounted to my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, for the startling fact just detailed, it did not the less fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period there came back into my spirit a half sentiment that seemed but was not remorse. I went so far to regret the loss of the animal and to look about me among the wild haunts which I now habitually frequented for another pet of the same species and of somewhat similar appearance, with which to supply its place. One night, as I sat half stupefied in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin or of rum, which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment.
I had been looking steadily at the top of this hogshead for some minutes, and what now caused me surprise was that the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon, I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a hair upon any portion of his not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite splotch of white, covering nearly the whole region of the breast. Upon my touching him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This then was the very creature which I was in search. I at once offered to purchase it of the landlord. But this person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, had never seen it before. I continued my caresses, and when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. When it reached the house, it domesticated itself at once and became immediately a great favorite with my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated. But I know not how or why it was. Its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed me. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature. A certain sense of shame and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty preventing me from physically abusing it, I did not for some weeks strike or otherwise violently ill use it. But very gradually, I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing and to flee silently from its odious presence, as from the breath of a pestilence. What added no doubt to my hatred of the beast was the discovery on the morning after I brought it home that, like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endeared it to my wife, who, as I have already said, possessed a high degree that humanity of feeling which had once been my distinguishing trait, and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with a pertinacity which it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caresses. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down, or fastening its long and sharp claws in my dress, clamber in this manner to my breast. At such times, although I wished to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from so doing, partly by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute fear of the beast. For I was not actually a dread of physical evil, and yet I know not how otherwise to define it. I am almost ashamed to own, yes, even in this felon's cell, I am almost ashamed to own that the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the merest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark of white hair, of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by slow degrees nearly imperceptible, and which for a long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful, it had at length assumed a rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shuddered to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a hideous, of a ghastly thing, of the gallows. Oh, mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime, of agony and of death. And now was I indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and a brute beast whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast to work out for me, a man fashioned in the image of high God. So much of insufferable scroll. Woe, alas, neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the former, the creature creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter I started early from dreams of unutterable fear to find the hot breath of thing upon my face, and its vast weight, an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Beneath the pressures of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts, the moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind. While from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outburst of a fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and the most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me upon some household errand into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs and nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal, which of course would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife, goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal. I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot without a groan. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith and with entire deliberation to the task to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbors. Many projects entered my head. At one period, I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again, I deliberated about casting it in the well in the yard, about packing it in a box as if merchandise with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take it from the house. Finally, I hit upon what I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims for a purpose which such as this, the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed and had lately been plastered throughout with a rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls was a projection caused by a false chimney or fireplace that had been filled up and made to resemble the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the whole as before, so that no one could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation, I was not unable to succeed. By the aid of a crowbar, I easily dislodged the bricks, and having carefully disrobed it in that position, while with little trouble, I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, with every possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this I very carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minutest care. I looked around triumphantly and said to myself, here at least then my labor was not been in vain. My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had at length firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet with it at the moment, there could have been no doubt of its fate. But it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed at the violence of my previous anger, and forbore to present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe or to imagine the deep, the blissful sense of relief which the absence of detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make it up its appearance. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus for one night at least, since its introduction into the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. At length, I slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and the third day passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed as a free man. The monster in terror had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. Upon the fourth day of this assassination, a party of the police came very unexpectedly into the house and proceeded again to make rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatever. The officers bade me accompany them in their search. They left no nook or corner unexplored. At length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not in a muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from one end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee at my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say, if but one word, by way of triumph and to render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness. Gentlemen, I said at last, as the party ascended the steps, I delight to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all health and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well constructed house. In the rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. I may say an excellently well constructed house. These walls, are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together. To the mere fence, I with a cane which I held in my hand, upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of my wife, of my bosom. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the arch-fiend. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb. By a cry, at first muffled and broken like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman. A howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony, and of the demons that exult in damnation. Of my own thoughts, it is folly to speak. Swooning, I staggered to the upper landing and instantly upon the stairs, motionless. Through extremity of terror and awe, in the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The wall, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Its head with red extended mouth and solitary eyes of a hideous beast whose crafty seduced me into murder and consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb.
Franz Kafka was born on 3rd of July 1883 and died on 3rd of June 1924, was a German-speaking Bohemian novelist and short story writer, widely regarded as one of the
Widely regarded as one of the major literature. Kafka was
major
born
figure
in
of
a
the
middle-class German family in Prague, the capital of
Kafka.
Kingdom of.
The capital of Kingdom of Bohemia, then part of Austro-Hungarian Empire, today the capital of the Kate's Republic. His work fuses element of realism and fantasy, themes of alienation, existential anxiety, guilt, and absurdity. He is best known for his work, including the short story Metamorphosis, the novel The Trial, and the Castle. Today, people use word Kafkaesque to signify senseless and sinister complexity.
It is a novella first published in 1915. The story begins with a traveling salesman, Gregor Samsa, waking to find himself transformed into a large monstrous insect-like creature. Cause is never revealed. The narrator is an anonymous figure who recounts the events of the story in a flat, neutral tone. Kafka's view of humanity found their origins in his idiosyncratic religious views lying somewhere outside the mainstream of Judaism. The absurdity of life, the disconnect between mind and body, the limits of sympathy, alienation has been shown. Metamorphosis, as professed earlier, is an autobiographical piece of writing, and we find that parts of the story reflects Kafka's own life. One morning, as Gregor Samsa was waking up from anxious dream, he discovered that in bed he had been changed into a monstrous verminous bug. He lay on his armor hard back and saw as he lifted his head up a little, his brown arched abdomen divided up into rigid bow-like sections. From this height, the blanket just about ready to slide off completely could hardly stay in place. His numerous legs, pitifully thin in comparison to the rest of his circumference, flickered helplessly before his eyes. What happened to me? He thought. It was no dream. His room, a proper room for a human being, though only somewhat too small, lay quietly between the four well known walls. Above the table on which an unpacked collection of sample cloth goods was spread out. Samson was a traveling salesman, hung the picture which he had cut he had cut out of an illustrated magazine a little while ago and set in a pretty gilt frame. It was a picture of a woman with a fur hat and a fur bow. She sat erect there, lifting up in the direction of the viewer a solid fur muff into which her entire forearm disappeared. Actually, he wanted to open the door. He really wanted to let himself seen by and to speak with the manager. He was keen to witness what the others now asking after him would say at the sight of him. If they were startled, then Gregor had no responsibility and could be calm. But if they accepted everything quietly, then he would have no reason to get excited, and if he got a move on, could really be at the station around 8 o'clock. What a quiet life the family leads, said Gregor to himself as he stared fixedly out in the front of him into the darkness. He felt a great pride that he had been able to provide such a life in a beautiful apartment like this for his parents and sister. But how would things go if now all tranquility, all prosperity, all contentment should come to a horrible end? In order not to lose himself in such thoughts, Gregor preferred to set himself moving and crawled up and down in his room. Am I going to be less sensitive? He thought, already sucking greedily on the cheese which had strongly aff- attracted him right away more than all the other foods, quickly with his eyes
quickly with his eyes watering with satisfaction. He ate one after the other the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh food, by contrast, didn't taste good to him. He couldn't bear the smell and even carried the things he wanted to eat at a little distance away. By the time his sister slowly turned the key as a sign that he should withdraw, he was long finished and now lay lazily in the same spot. Although
Although
Gregor
Gregor had kept repeating to himself over and over that really nothing unusual was going on, that only a few pieces of furniture were being arranged, he soon had to admit to himself that the movements of the woman to and fro Their quiet conversations, the scratching of the furniture on the floor, affected him like a great swirling commotion on all sides, and so firmly was he pulling in his head and legs and pressing his body into the floor. He had to tell himself unequivocally that he wouldn't be able to endure all this much longer. They were cleaning out his room, taking away from his everything he cherished. For the most part, when what went on now was very quiet. After the evening meal, the father fell asleep quickly in his armchair. The mother and sister talked guardedly to each other in the stillness. Bent far over the mother, she would find undergarments for a fashion shop. The sister, who had taken on a job as a sales girl in the evening, studied stenography and French so as perhaps later to obtain a better position. Sometimes the father woke up and, as if he was quite ignoring that he had been asleep, said to the mother, "How long have you been sewing today?" and went right back to sleep while the mother and the sister smiled tiredly to each other. He was determined to press forward to his sister to tug her dress and to indicate her in this way that she might still come with her violin into his room because here no one valued the recital as he wanted to value it. "My dear parents," said the sister, banging her hand on the table by the way of an introduction, "things cannot go any longer in this way. Maybe if you don't understand that well, I do. I will not utter my brother's name in front of this monster, and thus I say I only that we must try to get rid of it. We have tried what is humanly possible to take care of it and to be patient. I believe that no one can criticize us in the slightest. She is right in 1,000 ways," said the father to himself. The mother, who was still incapable of breathing properly, began to cough numbly with her hand held up over her mouth and a maniac expression in her eyes. "It must be gotten rid of," cried the sister. That is the only way, father. You must try to get rid of the idea that this is Gregor." "What now?" Gregor asked himself and looked around him in the darkness. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move at all. He was not surprised at that. On the contrary, it struck him as unnatural that he had really been able to this point to move around with these thin little legs. Besides, he felt relatively content. True, he had pains throughout his entire body, but it seemed to him that they were gradually becoming weak and weaker and would finally go away completely. He remembered his family with deep feeling and love. In this business, his own thought that he had to disappear was, if possible, even more decisive than his sister. He remained in this state of empty and peaceful reflection until the tower clock struck 3 o'clock in the morning. From the window he witnessed the beginning of the general dawning outside. Then, without willing it, his head sank all the way down, and from his nostrils flowed out weakly out his last breath. Some modernist elements from the Metamorphosis. The Metamorphosis, a novella by Franz Kafka that was published in 1915 during the start of the modernist movement in literature. Modernism was a literary movement that began in the late 1880s and continued through the 1930s. One element of modernism in the story is the absurd nature of the plot. A man turned into a giant beetle overnight with an explanation with no explanation or even much surprise on his part. Absurd situations weren't uncommon in modernist literature. The story was written entirely from Gregor's perspective or point of view. We are never given any outsider thoughts or feelings other than Gregor's observations. Another aspect of modernism is that the story proceeds as Gregor experiences and thinks of things. Sometimes it goes back in the time as he thinks of the past, or it skips forward if nothing happens for a few days or weeks. The focus is entirely on Gregor and what he is experiencing. The emphasis modernism had on an individual's emotion and reactions to the events. We see how Gregor adapted to modern society and his need for a job after his father's failed business. So then he started working specially hard with a fiery vigor that raised him from a junior salesman to a traveling representative almost overnight. Gregor's previous success all came to nothing in the end. He couldn't adapt to this new situation and he eventually starved to death. This sense of despair and loss is another modernist element.
The Lost Leaf by O. Henry. O. Henry is a famous short story writer and the novelist of 20th century. This story, which describes the life of women and who wants to die, and because of the belief towards the leaf. In a small part of a city west of Washington, grew the streets wild, gone through wild. They divided into directions and they are broken into small pieces called places. They are called different pieces called places. One street goes one street goes across itself one or two times. A painter discovered that something possible and valuable about the street. A painter suppose had some painting materials for which he had not paid. He had no money. Suppose a man came to get the money. Man might walk around the street, suddenly meet himself coming back without having the res or ascent. This part of the city is called the Greenwich Village. Soon a painter came Greenwich Village. Here they found rooms and they lighted with good lights at a low cost. Sue and Johnsy lived at the top of the building with 3 floors. One of these women from Maine and other from California ha- had had met at the restaurant on 8th Street. That day they decided they liked the same kind of art, same kind of food, and same kind of clothes. So they decided to live and work together. It was on a spring toward toward a winter. A cold stranger entered the village. He was he no one could he was no one was no one could see him. He walked around and touched the persons here and there with his fuzzy fingers. He was badly sickness. Doctor called him the pneumonia. On the eastern streets of the village, he hurried and touched many peoples. But for on the narrow streets of the village, he didn't move so quick. Pneumonia was not a gentleman, because for a gentleman would not had a little weak. Women from California, Mr. Pneumonia touched Johnsy with his cold finger. She lay on the bed, almost without moving. She looked out through the windows of her walls of the house next to her. One day morning, the doctor spoke to Sue alone at hall, where Johnsy could not hear. He's, she has a small chance, doctor said. She has a chance if she wants to live. But the people who don't want to live, I can't do anything for them. Your little lady decided that she is not going to get well. Is there something that troubling her? She wanted to paint a picture of Bay, Bay and Naples, paint, not a paint. Is there some is there is some worth being thing that troubled about? A man, Sue said. It's man worth. No, there is a weakness, doctor said. I know all how to do with, but a sick person have a sick person start began to feel that he's going to die. My hard work is no use. Talk with her about the new winter clothes if she were interested. it may the future, the better chance would for her. After the doctor had gone, Sue went to the room, went to the workroom and cried. Sue soon entered the room, entered Johnson's room with some painting materials and some painting materials. She was singing. Johnson lay there, very thin and quiet. Her face turned into the window. She stopped She stopped singing, thinking that she was asleep. She start work. She began her work. At work, she heard the low sound again and again. Quickly, Sue went to the bedside, and Johnsy started counting back and back. Sue look out the window. What was there to count? And this Johnsy started saying 12. Little later, she said 11. Then 10, 9, 8, 7, almost together. Then Then she said 6. What is a deer? Sue asked. 6, Johnsy said. Then she started counting again. What is that 5 deers? Please tell us, Sue. Johnsy said, 5 leaves on the tree. It was 3 days ago. I have started counting the leaves. At that time it was 100. Now it is 5. It's for me to count the easy. If the last leaf fell, I too must go die. Didn't doctor tell you this? Johnsy said. Oh, no, dear. I never heard such thing. There is nothing like that. Zoo said. Now you eat something, and after my work, I'll bring many things for you to eat to make you strong. Sue said. Then night, then I'll go to Johnson's. Then Johnsy, dear, will you promise me? Will you promise me? Close your eyes. You couldn't open and keep them closed. Will you promise me not to look out the window?
Please scroll the screen. Will you promise me to close your eyes and keep them closed? Will you promise me not to look out the window until I finish working? I must have this picture ready tomorrow. I need the light. I can't cover the window. Couldn't you work in the other room? Asked Johnsy coldly. I'd rather be here by you, said Sue, and I don't want you to look at those leaves. Tell me as soon as we are finished, said Johnsy. Sid closed her eyes and lay white and still because I wanted to see the last leaf fall. I had done enough waiting. I have done enough thinking. I want to go sailing down like one of those leaves. Try to sleep, said Sue. I must call Burham to come up here. I want to paint a man in the picture, and I'll make him look like Burham. I won't be gone a minute. Don't try to move till I come back. Old Barham was a painter who lived on the first floor of their house. He was past 60. He had no success as a painter. For 40 years, he had painted without ever painting a good picture. He had always talked of painting a great picture, a masterpiece, but he had never started. He got so little money by letting others paint pictures of him. He drank too much. He still talked of his great masterpiece, and he believed that it was a special duty to do everything possible to help Sue and Johnson. Sue found him in his dark room, and she knew that he had been drinking. She could smell it. She told him about Johnsy and the leaves on the wine. She said she was afraid that Johnsy would indeed sail down like the leaves. Her hold on his world was growing weaker. Old Berman shouted his anger over such an idea. What? He cried. Are there such fools? Do people die because leaves drop off a tree? I have not heard of such a thing. No, I will not come up and sit a while you make a picture of me. Why do you allow her to think of such a thing? The poor little Johnsy. She is very sick and weak, said Sue. The sickness had put these strange ideas into her mind, said Berman. If you won't come, you won't. But I don't think you are very nice. This is like a woman, shouted Berman. Who said I will not come? Go, I come with you. For half an hour I have been trying to say that I will come. God, this is not any place for someone as good as Johnsy to lie sick. Some days I shall paint my masterpiece, and we shall go away from here. God. Yes, Johnsy was sleeping when they went up. Sue covered the window and took Berman into the other room. There they looked out at the window fearfully at the tree. Then they looked at each other for a moment without speaking. A cold rain was falling, with a little snow in it too. Berman sat down and Sue began to paint. She worked through most of the night. In the morning, after an hour's sleep, she went to Johnsy's bedside. Johnsy, with wide open eyes, was looking at the window. I want to see, she told Sue. Sue took the cover off the window, but after the beating rain and the wild night that had not stopped through the whole night, there still was one leaf to be seen against the wall. It was the last in the tree. It was still dark green near the branch, but at the edges it was turning yellow with age. There it was hanging from a branch nearly 20 feet above the ground. It is the last one, said Johnsy. I thought it would surely fall during the night. I heard the wind. It will fall today, and I shall die at the same time. Dear, dear Johnsy, said Sue, think of me. If you won't think of yourself, what should I do? But Johnsy did not answer. The most lonely thing in the world is a soul when it's preparing to go on its far journey. The ties that held her to friendship and to earth were breaking one by one. The day slowly passed. As it grew dark, they could still see the leaf hanging from its branch against the wall. And then, as the night came, the north wind began to blow, the rain still beating against the windows. When it was light enough the next morning, Johnsy again commanded that she allowed to see. The leaf was still there. Johnsy lay for a long time looking at it, and then she called to Sue, who was cooking something for her to eat. I've been a bad girl, Sue, said Johnsy. Something had made the last leaf stay there to show me how bad I was. It is wrong to want to die. I'll try to eat now. But first, bring me a looking glass so that I can see myself. And then I'll sit up and watch you cook. An hour later, she said, Sue, someday I hope to paint the Bay of Naples. The doctor came in the afternoon. Sue followed him into the hall outside Johnson's room to talk to him. The chances are good, said the doctor. He took Sue's thin, shaking hand in his. Give her good care and she'll get well. And now I must see another sick person in this house. His name is Vernon. A painter, I believe, pneumonia, too. Mike is an old, weak man. He is very ill. There is no hope for him. But we take him to the hospital today. We will make it as easy for him as we can. The next day, the doctor said to Sue, she's safe. You have done it. Food and care now, that's all. And that afternoon, Sue came into the bed with Johnsy. She put one arm around her. I have something to tell you, she said. Mr. Berman died of pneumonia today in the hospital. He was ill only 2 days. Someone found him in the morning of the first day in his room. He was helpless with pain. His shoes and his clothes were wet with as cold as ice. Everyone wondered what had happened. That night had been so cold and wild. And then they found something. There was a paint that he had taken outside. And there were little material for painting. There was paint, green paint, and yellow paint. And look out of the window, dear, at the last leaf on the wall. Didn't you wonder why it never moved when the wind was blowing? Oh, my dear, it is Berman's great masterpiece. He painted it the night that the last leaf fell.
Christmas Carol. Charles John Haffam Dickens was born on February 1812 at Landport, Portsmouth, United Kingdom. He was an English writer and social critic. He created some of the world's best known fictional characters and is regarded by many as the greatest novelist of the Victorian era. His works enjoyed unprecedented popularity during his lifetime, and by the 20th century, critics and scholars had recognized him as a literary genius. His novels and short stories are widely read today. A Christmas Carol can be read as a moral tale, showing what can happen to a man who is consistently self centered and unkind. The moral message of the novella is that all human beings have the opportunity to behave in kinder ways towards each other. The four major themes of this novella are forgiveness, the influence of the past, greed, and poverty. This is a well loved and commonly read the novella that focuses on Christmas and poverty. With With the title of the book being A Christmas Carol, we would expect Christmas to feature prominently throughout the novel, but it also depicts a massive equality gap between the rich and the poor. Being such a short story, there is a very little extraneous. Of course, Dickens does use his trademark lengthy description, but nearly everything has point. The symbols that are used to express a different meaning, like Marley's chain, the ghost, the fire, etc. Through this, Dickens tries to represent the British social attitude towards poverty, particularly child poverty, and wished to use the novella as a means to put forward the argument against it. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon. Change for anything he chose to put his hands to. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. Mind, I do not mean to say that I know my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade, but the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew that his friend was dead, but the death of his friend did not affect him that much. Though he was his sole friend, sole executor, and what not, Scrooge was not cut up by the sad evil. He started the next day as well as an ideal businessman. How now? Said Scrooge, caustic and as cold as ever. What do you want with me? Much. Marley's voice, no doubt about it. Who are you? Ask me who I was. Who were you then? Said Scrooge, raising his voice. You are particular for a shade. He was going to say to a shade, but substituted his this as more appropriate. In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley. The first time Marley showed up, he was sure that Marley has come in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights, and boots. He could see everything in detail on Marley. Seeing Marley, he felt the chilling influence of its dead cold eyes. As Scrooge was not very good in cracking jokes, he acted smartly, though the voice kept him feel terrified. Scrooge was asking questions like, "Do you use this toothpick?" Marley responded, "Yes, I do." Scrooge fell on his knees and asked for mercy and asked for the reason why he is troubling him again. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if it is hold, were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were like those upper members bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and, in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. One fine day when Scrooge woke up, he could hear the clock striking at 12. He knew that it would be Marley. He could sense that the curtains were drawn aside by a hand. The spirit said, "I am the ghost of Christmas past." It was like a casual conversation between Scrooge and the spirit. The spirit called upon Scrooge for a walk. The spirit recollected Scrooge's experience in the past and told about a child who was left all alone by his friends. And Scrooge reinforced, saying that he knew who the child was. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which this spirit moved it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its face, its head, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this, it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. He felt that it was tall and stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with a solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. "I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come," said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its head. "You are about to show me shadows of things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us," Scrooge pursued. "Is that so, spirit?" The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received. The last appearance of the spirits made him feel terrified. He experienced a vague, uncertain horror this time. It was the ghost of future. Scrooge surrendered himself entirely, promising the spirit that he will be a good person. At this moment, Scrooge was inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach some importance to attach to the conversation.
The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire, quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them. Where had Scrooge heard those words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand up to her face. The color hurts my eyes, she said. The color? Ah, poor Tiny Tim. They are better now again, said Cratchit's wife. It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be near his time. Past it rather, Peter answered, shutting up his book. But I think he was walked a little slower than he used. These few last evenings, mother, they were very quick again. At last, she said, and in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once. I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed. And so have I, cried Peter. Often, and so have I, exclaimed another. So had all, but he was very light to carry. She resumed, intent upon her work, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble, no trouble, and there is your father at the door. After witnessing this scene, Ebenezer Scrooge had a change of heart. We discover changes in his character and he makes amendments in his behavior. I will live in the past, the present, and the future, Scrooge repeated as he scrambled out of bed. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. O Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time be praised for this. I say it on my knees, old Jacob on my knees. He was so fluttered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer to his call. He had been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears. Scrooge is grateful for a second chance in his life. He is genuinely overjoyed and bubbling with excitement. He apologizes for his previous rudeness and donates huge sums of money to the poor people. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and the little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good, at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset. And knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought it quiet as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins, as have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, If any man alive possess the knowledge, may that be truly said of us and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. Finally, in the conclusion, a new Ebenezer Scrooge starting off with his new life with a comic display of happiness and Christmas cheer. He is literally a saved man, and the story of his redemption ends with a note of an extraordinary optimism.
Rip Van Winkle is a humorous short story written by the American author Washington Irving. It was first published in 1819. It is addressed in the background of a Dutch American village in colonial America. The protagonist is Rip Van Winkle, who wanders in the Catskill Mountains, falls asleep, and wakes up after 20 years. Irving wrote this story during his stay in Birmingham, England. It was part of the collection of stories named The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gent. The collection helped him proceed with a literary career and gained international fame. Irving also exposed the history and tradition of the Catskill Mountains through the tale of Rip Van Winkle. Whosoever has made a voyage up the Hudson must remember the Catskill Mountains. They are a dismembered branch of the great Appalachian family and are seen away to the west of the river, swelling up to a noble height and lording it over the surrounding country. Every change of season, every change of weather, indeed every hour of the day produces some change in the magical hues and shapes of this mountain, and they are regarded by all the good wives, far and near, as perfect barometers. When the weather is fair and settled, they are clothed in blue and purple, and print their bold outlines on the clear evening sky. But sometimes, when the rest of the landscape is cloudless, they will gather a hood of grey vapors about their summits, which in the last ray of the setting sun will glow and light up like a crown of glory. The story opens with a vivid description of Hudson River Valley and the Catskill Mountains, where Rip lives in the small farm village in around the year 1770. This village was founded by the Dutch settlers, and the narrator of the story, Diederik Knickerbocker, is narrating and describing the beautiful scenery of this place. Rip Van Winkle, however, was one of those happy mortals of foolish, well-oiled dispositions who take the world easy, eat white bread or brown, whichever can be got, with least thought or trouble, and would rather starve on a penny than work for a pound. If left to himself, he would have wished life away in perfect contentment. But his wife kept continually dinning in his ears about his idleness, his carelessness, and the ruin he was bringing on his family. Morning, noon, and night, her tongue was incessantly going, and everything he said or did was sure to produce a torrent of household eloquence. Rip had but one way of replying to all the lectures of the kind, and that by frequent use had grown into a habit. He shrugged his shoulders, shook his head, cast up his eyes, but said nothing. This, however, always provoked a fresh volley from his wife, so that he was fain to draw off his forces and take to the outside of the house, the only side which in truth belongs to a henpecked husband. Rip Van Winkle is a very friendly and tranquil fellow. He is very helpful and generous in his nature, but he has only one flaw in him, and that is that he is unable to earn profits from any work. He is always ready to help others and without getting lazy. He just is unable to work at home. This infuriates his wife, Dame Van Winkle, and she rebukes him for this. She even follows him down to the village, at which he only listens to her partially. Whenever Dame Van Winkle creates a mess, he heads outside to an inn where he sits with people and gossips about political and philosophical issues. As he was about to descend, he heard a voice from a distance hallooing, Rip Van Winkle, Rip Van Winkle. He looked around, but could see nothing but a crow winging its solitary flight across the mountain. He
thought his fancy must have deceived him and turned again to descend, when he heard the same cry ring through the still evening air. Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle! At the same time, Wolf bristled up his back and giving a low growl, skulked to his master's side, looking fearfully down into the glen. Rip now felt a vague apprehension stealing over him. He looked anxiously in the same direction and perceived a strange figure slowly toiling up the rocks and bending under the weight of something he carried on his back. He was surprised to see any human being in this lonely and unfrequented place, but supposing it to be someone of the neighborhood in need of his assistance, he hastened down to yield it. Once during a visit to the woods of Catskills, Van Winkle reaches the top of the height. He rests for a while as the climbing has made him tired. But as soon as he stands up to return home, he hears that someone has called his name. He sees the shadow of a man who seems to be in need of help. He reaches to him and notices that the man is strange and square in face, short in height, has bushy hair and brooded beard. He is attired in an old traditional Dutch dress. He asks Van Winkle to help him climb the cask at the height above. As Rip and his companion approached them, they suddenly desisted from their play and stared at him with fixed statue-like gaze, and such strained, uncouth, lackluster countenance that his heart turned within him and his knees smote together. His companion now emptied the contents of the keg into large flagons and made signs to him to wait upon the company. He obeyed with fear and trembling. They quaffed the liquor in profound silence and then returned to their game. By degrees, Rip's awe and apprehension subsided. He even ventured, when no eye was fixed upon him, to taste the beverage, which he found had much of the flavor of excellent Holland. He was naturally a thirsty soul, and soon tempted to repeat the draught. One taste provoked another, and he reiterated his visits to the flagon so often that at length his senses were overpowered. His eyes swam in his head gradually declined, and he fell asleep. On waking, he found himself on the green knoll, whence he had first seen the old man of the glen. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright, sunny morning. The birds were hopping and twittering among the bushes, and the eagle was wheeling aloft and breathing the pure mountain breeze. Surely, thought Rip, I have not slept here all night. He recalled the occurrences before he fell asleep. The strange man with a keg of liquor, the mountain ravine, the wild retreat among the rocks, the woe-begone party at Ninepins, the flagon. Oh, that flagon, that wicked flagon, thought Rip. What excuse shall I make to Dame Van Winkle? He looked round for his gun, but in place of the clean, well-oiled fowling piece, he found an old fire rock lying by him, the barrel encrusted with rust, the lock falling off, and the stock worm-eaten. He now suspected that the grave roysters of the mountain had put a trick upon him, and having dosed him with liquor, had robbed him of his gun. Wolf too had disappeared, but he might have strayed away from after a squirrel or partridge. He whistled after him and shouted his name, but all in vain. The echoes repeated his whistle and shout, but no dog was seen. After helping the man reach the white stadium like a place where a lot of people like him were gathered. Their gathering was making the surroundings scruffy and thundering, and Rip noticed that that was because of their game that they were playing. Then the man starts serving drinks from the cask that he brought along with Rip, and asks Rip Van Winkle with a gesture to help him. Rip tries the drink and it tastes delighting, so he takes one more drink and then again and again until he is too drunk to walk. He lies down on the ground and falls asleep. In the morning, when he wakes up and suddenly gets anxious about the reaction of his wife, who will inquire for his late arrival, he hurriedly approaches his gun, but finds it corroded and ears rotten as if it never has been used. He calls his dog Wolf, but it does not respond. He feels quite rigid physically. He gets up, tries to retrace his footsteps, but finds that the area has entirely changed. He now hurried forth and hastened to his old resort, the village inn, but it too was gone. A large rickety wooden building stood in its place with great gaping windows, some of them broken and mended with old hats and petticoats. And over the door was painted the Union Hotel by Jonathan Doolittle. Instead of the great tree and that used to shelter the quiet little Dutch inn of yore, there now was reared a tall, naked pole with something on the top that looked like a red nightcap, and from it was fluttering a flag on which was a singular assemblage of stars and stripes. All this was strange and incomprehensible. He recognized on the sign, however, the ruby face of King George, under which he had smoked so many a peaceful pipe. But even this was singularly metamorphosed. The red coat was changed for one of blue and buff. A sword was held in the hand instead of scepter. The head was decorated with a cocked hat, and underneath was painted in large characters General Washington. He then returns to the village, but everything has here also is also here transformed. The village has grown large, and he feels unable to comprehend all of his surroundings, and so the village people too. His beard is grown foot long, and he seems odd to be walking amid this group. People are staring with wonder, and children hoot at him. Even the dogs are not friendly with him. He thinks he has gone crazy, and he moves towards his house, but it is abandoned and it in utter despair. Then he goes to the inn where he used to often go to discuss political affairs with his friends. Even that spot where the picture of George III was hanged is now replaced with George Washington. People in the club are completely different ones, and their discussions, opinions are very different from his own. Rip now resumes his old walk and habits. He soon found many of his former cronies, though all rather the worse for the wear and tear of time, and preferred making friends among the rising generation, with whom he would be soon grew into great favor. Having nothing to do at home and being arrived at the happy age when a man can be idle with impunity, he took his place once more on the beach at the inn door, and was reverenced as one of the patriarchs of the village, and a chronicle of old times before the war. It was some time before he could get into the regular track of gossip, or could be made to comprehend the strange events that had taken place during his torpor. How that there been had been a revolutionary war, that the country had thrown off the yoke of old England, and that instead of being a subject to His Majesty George III, he was now a free citizen of the United States. Rip, in fact, was no politician. The changes of states and empires made but little impression on him. But there was one species of despotism under which he had long groaned, and that was petticoat government. Happily, that was at end. He got his neck out of the yoke of matrimony and could go in and out whenever he pleased, without dreading the tyranny of Dame Winkle. Whenever her name was mentioned, however, he shook his head, shrugged his shoulders, and cast up his eyes, which might pass either for an expression of resignation to his fate or joy at his deliverance. He used to tell this story to every stranger that arrived at Mr. Doolittle's hotel. He was observed at first to vary on some points every time he told it, which was doubtless owing to his having so recently awaked. It at last settled down precisely to the tale I have related, and not a man, woman, or child in the neighborhood but knew it by heart. Some always pretended to doubt the reality of it, and insisted that Rip had been out of his head, and that this was one point on which he always remained flighty. The old Dutch inhabitants, however, almost universally gave it full credit. Even to this day, they never hear a thunderstorm of a summer afternoon about the Catskill, but they say Hendrik Hudson and his crew are at their game of ninepins, and it is a common wish of all henpecked husbands in the neighborhood. When wife hangs heavy on their hands, that they might have a quieting draught out of Rip Van Winkle's flagon.
So that brings us to the end of today's session. We have also tried to narrate the story apart from the excerpts in our own words. Thank you for being so patient and listening to us. And we also apologize for the disturbance in reading due to the network issues. See you all next Sunday at 2 p.m. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice day.